Welcome to the AACE Australian Section 2026 webinar series. The topic of this webinar is Understanding Estimate Accuracy and is presented by Larry Dysert.
First of all, thank you everyone for joining. I understand that there's some trouble of audio and etc. And thank you for bearing and for your patience. We are very pleased to have here Larry Dysert with us. Some of you may already know him by repetition. He's the managing partner of Conquest Consulting Group and even a senior principal at Long International, which has a lot of publications all over the world. He has more of 4 to 5 years hands-on experience in estimating, project controls, and risk management across major global capital projects. He's also in the AAC. He's a certified cost professional, certified estimating professional, and decision and risk management professional. He's still a major contributor to AAC International for many years and authored and shaped a significant number of recommended practices. He's a frequent presenter, and today we have one of his unique presentations that he's luckily that he's presenting it to us here for all of us to learn from it. So I think, Larry, the mic is for you. You can start the presentation whenever you're ready, mate.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, I'm very happy to be able to make this presentation to you today on understanding and communicating estimate accuracy. You can see the screen in full screen mode, correct?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Okay, yes. Very good. So we're going to kind of start at the beginning here then, just to make sure that we're grounded on what an estimate is. And when we talk about estimating today, we're primarily talking about capital project estimating, although the basic concepts will apply to any other type of estimating as well. But we define a cost estimate as a prediction of the probable costs of a project. And that's going to be a prediction always for a given and documented scope of work, typically to be completed at a defined location at some point of time in the future. So the key to this is understanding that every estimate is a prediction. And although when we use our estimating software or Excel or however we're preparing the estimate, we typically get a single number that's provided as the total value for our estimate. Being a prediction, a single number doesn't actually convey all the information about the estimate that we need to. Every estimate should really be considered a potential range of values. And any value within that range may be selected as the funding value by management. But that single value can never convey the uncertainty that's associated with every estimate or every prediction of value. What's important is when we understand that an estimate is a prediction of probable costs, our task of estimating is to prepare that prediction. But that's not the purpose of estimating. Although that's the task we try to accomplish, the purpose of estimating is always to support decision making. The estimate itself has really no value. It's simply a set of numbers if it's not being used to support a decision by our management, by our client, or whoever. And when we understand that the purpose of estimating is to support decision making, then that should key us into providing much more information about our estimate so that the most effective decision is made based on the work that we've presented. As a prediction, we should understand that uncertainty then exists in every element of our project estimates. As we work through our project development phases, towards a final funding stage, we're incrementally developing scope and improving our estimating processes based on that improved scope definition, so that we're trying to reduce uncertainty as much as we can. But we're never going to eliminate uncertainty associated with our prediction of the estimated value. If we look at the basic estimating algorithm, where we understand that the cost for the estimate equals quantities times a unit material cost plus quantities times a unit labor hours times the wage rate to get the labor component of our estimate. Every one of these items highlighted in red, the quantities or unit material costs or unit labor hours, any assumptions we've made, any assumptions around labor productivity adjustments that we might make for the unique site conditions, and the wage rate, they're all subject to uncertainty. The only absolute thing we know about our estimates is that it's wrong. The chances, certainly on any significantly sized estimate, that the final estimated cost comes within $1 of our estimated value is minuscule. It just doesn't happen. Our quantities are wrong, our material costs are wrong, our unit labor hours applied to various labor operations are wrong, and the wage rate's wrong. We try to be very close, but there's variability associated with each one of those estimates. Now, I mentioned every estimate is going to involve some assumptions. Every estimate is going to involve some uncertainty. And therefore, every estimate is going to be associated with some level of error. And in order to be able to meet the purpose of developing the estimate to support decision making, we need to both be able to understand and communicate that level of error, what we often call estimate accuracy. And when we're dealing with uncertainties like this, our goal is to try to associate that range of numbers with the probabilities associated with any particular value within that range of cost outcomes. When we prepared our estimate, when we've gone through a process to try to evaluate the uncertainty associated with our estimates, and we include that contingency value to cover uncertainty within our estimates, the one thing we need to make sure of, though, is that our estimate involves a given scope. Contingency is not identified to cover any significant changes in the defined scope of the project. It may cover some minor variability expected at the particular phase of project development that we're in, but if we add scope to the project, we need to reevaluate and prepare a new estimate for that given scope. Again, what we're trying to do is be able to support decision making by being able to describe our estimate well to the decision makers and describe accuracy to those decision makers. And when I'm involved in reviewing estimates and asking the estimators how well they think their estimate is, they often might provide a description of estimate accuracy, something like this, where they're describing that the cost estimate has an accuracy range of -15% to +30%. That's not a valid description of estimate accuracy. If that's the only thing that we're explaining when we're trying to convey estimate accuracy to decision makers, that really provides no consequential information to base a decision upon. So the whole goal when we talk about estimate accuracy is to be able to understand this particular diagram very, very well. And I'll walk through this right now. We mentioned that the estimate is not a single value. In this particular example, that single value that appeared at the bottom of the page is $1 million. That's our base estimate before considering the uncertainty associated with our estimate. But every estimate is a range of values. Every estimate is actually the blue curve shown on this particular diagram. A blue curve that identifies a range of values across our x-axis. We generate that curve through risk analysis. And although we'll talk a little bit about risk analysis later in this presentation, but that's not the focus of this presentation. But when we use quantitative risk analysis, or QRA, that typically can generate a cost probability distribution, the blue curve associated with our estimate. Once we have that blue curve, then we can start talking and communicating intelligently about the accuracy of our estimate. You may be familiar with the term a p-value, a p50 value, a p10 value, a p90 value. When we talk about p-values, that's the probability of underrun associated with any value along the x-axis. So in this particular relatively simple example, our p10 value, our value that has that provides just a 10% probability of underrun, is 800,000. Our p90 value, the value associated with our estimate that would provide a 90% probability of underrun, and therefore only a 10% probability or chance of overrun, is 1.4 million. In this diagram, our base estimate before evaluating a contingency value is 1 million. That's our base estimate, or sometimes called our point estimate. And typically, this blue curve is going to be a skewed distribution, a positively skewed distribution, meaning that the tail on the right extends in absolute value farther than the tail extends in absolute value on the left. And our point estimate, typically before adding any funds for uncertainty, is to the left of the mode of this distribution, the mode being that one single value that most often occurs within this range of values. Most of the time then, our base value is something like only a p20 to a p30 probability of underrun. And management typically doesn't want to fund projects with only a less than 50% chance of underrun or coming in on budget. So the p50 value is the median of our cost distribution, where 50% of the area under the curve lies to the left of that value, 50% of the area under the curve runs to the right of that, lies to the right of that value. And that's the median value. That's the value that gives us a 50% probability of underrun. And in a skewed distribution, that's always going to be to the right of the mode. That still is not the arithmetic average. The actual mean of this distribution will be even further to the right than the median value. The actual arithmetic mean of our cost distribution is always going to be to the right of the median with a positively skewed distribution. So if we understand that our estimate is the blue curve, and once we have the blue curve, we can establish various p-values. And if management wants to fund at a 50% probability of underrun, we simply need to add money to our point estimate to reach that value. And that's what contingency is. It's just an arithmetically derived value to reach a selected probability of underrun where management wants to fund our projects at. Before we consider this additional funds, if we want to talk about estimate accuracy, and if we're talking about estimate accuracy in terms of percent, then in this example, it would be -20 to +40%. But that's around the point value of the estimate, the $1 million. If we talk about estimate accuracy in terms of percent to our P50, or our most likely funded value for the estimate, then we end up in a situation like this. In this particular case, contingency added $100,000, moving us from our point estimate of 1 million to 1.1 million as the P50 value. The P10 value hasn't changed, it's still 800,000. The P90 value hasn't changed, it's still 1.4 million. But if we discuss estimate accuracy in terms of percent, it's now around a larger value. And instead of being -20 to +40, in this simple example, it's now -27% to +27%. We have to be very careful when we talk about estimate accuracy in terms of percent, because we not only have to describe which number it's around, our selected funding value, or our point estimate, but we should also describe the confidence interval associated with that with those percents. In this case, we're selecting our percents between the P10 and the P90 value. In other words, that's providing us an 80% confidence interval that we're between 800,000 and 1.4 million. Personally, I never like to talk about estimate accuracy in terms of percent, because if I do that, I have to add more information than just saying it's -15 to +30, or -20 to +40, or -27 to +27. If I talk about it in percents, I need to say, well, what is the confidence interval that applies to? I have to define the specific value, the selected value within this range of values where those percents apply. I would much rather talk about estimate accuracy in terms of absolute value. I'm 80% confident that we're between 800,000 and 1.4 million. And if management wants to fund to where they achieve at least a 50% probability of underrun, then our selected funding value is the median of this distribution. It's the P50 value of 1.1 million. We've now conveyed much more information about our estimate to management. So if we're going to talk about it in percents, we need to provide this other information. In this particular example, it's -27% to +20%, +27% around the point estimate with contingency, the P50 value, at 80% confidence we're within that range. So when we're talking about estimate accuracy in terms of percent, I always must define not only the percent, but the associated probability of underrun or the confidence level associated with it. If I describe estimate accuracy to the decision makers in terms of absolute value, then I don't have to define what number is my funding number. I can describe estimate accuracy in terms of I'm 80% confident I'm between the P10 value of 800,000 and the P90 value of 1.4 million. Typically, we're going to use a confidence interval of 80% between P10 and P90, or perhaps 90% between P5 and P95. I would never want to actually describe I'm 100% confident I'm between the two end values of the tails of the distribution, because in reality, these get rather asymptotic. Our risk analysis may give us a value for P100 probability of underrun, but that's not to say that's an absolute. So typically, we're always choosing an 80% or a 90% confidence interval to describe this range of accuracy for our decision makers. In general, the results of our risk analysis is going to be this blue curve, a positively skewed distribution. And so we want to be able to understand these positively skewed distributions. Typically, our base estimate is going to be to the left of the mode. The mode is that value within the distribution, that single value that has the highest relative probability of occurrence associated with any other value along our x-axis. The median is always to the right of the mode. The mean, or the arithmetic average of our distribution, is even further right to the median. Our median is typically the P50 value, 50% probability of underrun. Most of the time, our mean for most capital projects lies somewhere in that P53 to about P58 value. So between a 53% probability of underrun to a 58% probability of underrun. Now let's look at why is our base estimate typically so far to the left of these distributions. So why is our base estimate typically below that P50 or median value? Again, coming back to our basic estimating algorithm of quantities times the material cost plus quantities times the unit chart hours times a productivity adjustment for site conditions times the wage rate to get the wage component or the labor component of our estimates. Again, each one of these is subject to uncertainty. Each one of these, the uncertainty around our quantities is also probably a skewed distribution. The uncertainty around our material pricing, or our productivity adjustments, or even the wage rate typically might be a skewed distribution. Let's look at a simple example where we have three components to our estimate. Components A, B, and C, and to each of these, we've tried to evaluate the uncertainty associated with it. And for item A, we've decided that our estimated value, our most likely value that we think will occur is 20. But the minimum, we don't think it'll go below 15. We don't think it'll go higher than 30. For item B, our most likely value is 50. We don't think it will go below 40. We don't think it will go above 65. Or item C, most likely value of 40. Don't think it'll go below 36. We don't think it'll go 48. What we can see is here we have a tighter range of values around item C than we do the other components. But each one we can estimate kind of a 3-point estimate to each of these major components. And we can add them up and say, well, the estimate is simply the total of these 3 elements. 20 plus 50 plus 40 gives us a value of 110. But to understand whether that 110 is actually achievable, let's assign in this particular example, a triangular distribution to each of these ranges for each element, and run that through a Monte Carlo simulation and see what the overall results are. And when I take those values, I end up with a triangular distribution representing item A and item B and item C, and an overall distribution, the overall results of my Monte Carlo simulation, that is still a bit of a skewed distribution, but it looks much more normal than these other 3. When I look at that overall probability distribution, what I find is that value of 110, I added up the most likely values for each of those 3 elements. And yet that total value of 110 only has a 24% chance of underrun. If I want to get to at least a 50% probability of underrun, I need to select the median value. And over here, we can see that that median value is approximately 114.5. So I would need to add contingency so that we are funding over here at 114.5. So this is a really important concept to understand, because all the elements, most of the elements in our estimate will typically be skewed to the right. They have a chance for things to go wrong, are increasing costs by a higher value than potentially being lucky or taking advantage of an opportunity to reduce costs. So this median value, then we would add, if that's our funding value, contingency is nothing more than taking that selected funding value minus the point value of the estimate before uncertainty. So here is those 3 values. Here's where we added up to the 110. When we look at those triangular distributions, here's the mean value. Instead of 20, the actual mean value of that distribution for item A is 21.7. The mean value for item B is 51.7. The mean value for the distribution here is 114.7. If we look at the P10, the P50s, the P90s of these individual elements, they add up to 100, 113, basically 130. The problem with skewed distributions, though, is that we can't actually just add the P50 values and say this is the P50, the overall P50 value of that resulting cost distribution. Other than a normal distribution, probabilities are not additive. I can't add up all the P10 numbers or the P50 numbers or the P90 numbers and get the equivalent for the overall distribution. We'll see here that for the overall cost distribution, our average was 114.6667, but the P50 value was 114.46, just slightly below this mean value. So in comparison to the triangular distributions here, what's happened is this overall probability distribution has narrowed in range. If I simply added up the P10 values, I'd have a range of 100 to 130. But the actual overall distribution between the P10 and the P90 value at that overall level is between 106 and 123. That's simply statistical theory kicking in, probability theory. And two effects are happening. When I have multiple elements within my Monte Carlo simulation, the relative ranges of the overall distribution tends to tighten up or centralize around the mean value. That's basically portfolio effect or central limit theorem kicking in. Then also, we always need to understand that the actual average, the mean of our positively skewed distribution, is higher than that median or P50 value. So again, once we go through Monte Carlo simulation or some other quantitative risk analysis methodology, and some quantitative methodologies you won't necessarily use Monte Carlo, but the goal is we have to get the blue curve. We have to end up with a probability distribution, and then we simply are adding money from our point estimate to the selected funding value to determine contingency. It's nothing more than a mathematical calculation. But that's covering the uncertainty required to get us to that 50% probability of underrun if we're selecting the median as our funding value. Now we should understand, what does this amount we're defining for a contingency actually cover? And it basically covers any errors and omissions in our estimating process. It covers minor design changes within our agreed upon scope, but not any major change to scope. And it covers the inherent variability around our quantities, our labor productivity, our labor hours, our labor wage rates, and any other pricing variability. But contingency specifically excludes changes in scope, any major disaster that might hit our project, other significant event-driven risks, what we might often call very high impact, but very low probability. So it doesn't cover disasters, or typically some of these HILP, high impact, low probability events, as would COVID or a pandemic be. And it doesn't cover escalation. Escalation is a separate risk fund that should have its own evaluation methodologies. When we're trying to define uncertainty to enter into our risk models, our risk analysis models, we might divide those between systemic risks, risks that are inherent to our project development and estimating practices, versus very project-specific risks. So we typically tend to name these systemic versus project-specific. Systemic risks are the overall level of scope definition. And these tend to be this is the dominant driver of uncertainty in our early phases of project development. When we're back here at, if you understand the term FEL, front-end loading, or FEL 1, 2, or 3, back here at FEL 1 and FEL 2, that level of scope definition just dominates the uncertainty around our projects, as well as perhaps the level of complexity or technology, the quality of our reference data, the quality of the assumptions we've made in preparing our estimate, and so forth. Project-specific risks typically get more significant during FEL2, but certainly during that last stage of project development leading up to our authorization gate, gate 3 in this example. And that might, now we have enough scope definition where we can, and planning definition, that we better understand, well, what's the timing? How will timing be affected by adverse weather? We have a selected defined location now. We've done enough development to understand what the site conditions are. We understand some of the logistical issues that might be involved with equipment or material delivery. We have more definition to support a better assessment of labor availability. These are all project-specific risks that need to be addressed in our quantitative risk analysis. But our basic key to contingency determination is using risk analysis. We have to use something to generate the probability curve. And that risk analysis process should address both our systemic and our project-specific risks. And once I have that resulting probability distribution, now I can determine the contingency value based on how much money do I need to add to reach management's preference on a probability of underrun. Most often, on certainly most common projects within our organizations, that's probably the median value or the mean value, one or the other. But there may be some projects where management decides to actually fund at a higher p-value, p70 or p80, because for that particular project, they decide that their risk tolerance, to meet their level of risk tolerance, they want to fund at a 70% probability of underrun or an 80% probability of underrun. But in either case, contingency or risk funds is simply the value added to our point estimate to reach that desired level of confidence of underrunning our estimate. The one thing we need to understand is contingency has absolutely zero effect on estimate accuracy, on the range of values associated with our estimate. This range of values at an 80% confidence interval between 800,000 and 1.4 million doesn't change because we've added contingency. We've improved our funding decision. We haven't affected estimate accuracy. Although it may appear that way if we talk about estimate accuracy in terms of percent, where it was minus 20 to plus 40 at the point estimate, but minus 27 to plus 27 in this simple example around the P50 value. But in absolute terms, we haven't affected estimate accuracy. The only thing that affects estimate accuracy is if we can change the blue curve. If we can get this blue curve to be steeper in the middle or less elongated at the tails. If we can bring in the tails of the distribution, that affects estimate accuracy. But to do that, we typically need more project development, better pricing, changing some of our assumptions into knowns. So estimate contingency never affects estimate accuracy. And the other thing we need to make sure we understand is that those estimate ranges in our estimate classification recommended practices, which are actually range of ranges. So for a class 5, that high range may be from plus 30 to plus 100, or the low range from minus 20 to plus 50. Class 3, plus 10 to plus 30, the low range from minus 10 to minus 20. This range of ranges provides us a target estimate accuracy that we expect to be able to achieve if all of our planning and technical deliverables for the estimate meet the expectations defined in that estimate classification document. And if we're talking about these ranges around the P50 value, around the median, 50% probability of underrun value. but those are only defining target or expected estimate accuracy ranges. The accuracy range for a completed estimate should only be determined by an appropriate risk analysis, by coming up with some modeling mechanism to generate the blue curve, to generate that probability cost distribution. Now we're going to understand that greater definition typically improves estimate accuracy. So as we move from class 5 to class 4 to class 3, most funding decisions are at class 3 level definition. But if we move further to class 2, as we get more definition, as we reduce the number of assumptions that we're making, as we get better pricing and better scope definition, these ranges do narrow, as shown in this diagram. Now we need to be careful that we don't blame our estimate accuracy or our contingency determination if we overrun our estimate. Number one, if we fund our estimate at P50, there's a 50% probability we're going to overrun that value. And we need to be careful because if we've underestimated contingency in those early phases, that can sometimes drive perceived cost growth in later estimates. As we get better definition, when we redo our estimate, we get a different probability distribution. So if we're not using risk analysis in those early phases, and we're just assigning what we think is a proper range, then we may be in trouble in later stages. And the other thing is if we fund contingency for things it should not cover, for using contingency to cover scope change, which is all too common in our industry, then we're using up the uncertainty funds for scope change and not for the actual variabilities it was supposed to cover. We need to be careful because scope growth or scope change can be interpreted differently by various project stakeholders. Our owner business units and corporate management often evaluates the scope change only as changes to the overall capacity or performance specifications. Whereas our project team is typically looking at scope change as being any significant change to those key defining technical deliverables completed for that particular stage. So by class 3, that would be the final equipment list, the final and approved P&IDs, the final and approved site and plot plans. For adding equipment, and certainly from a project team perspective of putting this estimate together, we add equipment, we need to add dollars to the estimate. We don't fund that from contingency. And then when we're dealing, if we are a construction contractor or we're the owner dealing with a construction contractor, contractors are going to evaluate scope change as any change that deviates from their contract and any of the supporting documentation behind that particular contract. So to kind of summarize here, estimate accuracy is this indication of the degree to which we think the final actual cost outcome might differ or vary from our estimated cost. We have to understand and communicate that every estimate is a prediction of the expected final cost, but not the absolute final cost. And as a prediction, every estimate is a range of values. It's not a single number. Every prediction or every estimate is going to be associated with an uncertainty. And therefore, any value within that range of values is associated with a probability of underrun or overrunning that predicted cost. But we certainly want to be able to communicate. Our estimates should not be regarded as single point values. If all we're providing to management is that estimate plus contingency value, they don't have the information they need to make the most effective decision. We need to define what that range of values is and how significant that range of values may be, especially as we get to the tail of the high side values. But that accuracy range is just this probabilistic assessment of how far the actual cost may vary from our estimated cost. So to describe estimate accuracy, we undertake quantitative risk analysis to generate the blue curve or cost probability distribution, and then we can intelligently convey information. We can talk about at a 80% confidence level or between 800,000 to 1.4 million. If we want to fund at P50, our P50 value is 1.1 million. We should recognize and make sure that we inform management of the uncertainty still associated with our estimate. All of this stuff over to the right, even at a P90 value, we'd have to add another 300,000 to our 1.1 P50 value. So by funding here, we have a 50% probability of overrun. We don't know if we're going to overrun by a small amount or a large amount, but we should certainly indicate to management how significant these P70, P80, and P90 values are. We want to make sure that we're going to convey meaningful information to decision makers and to all the estimate stakeholders. And that implies then that we're going to talk about the uncertainty associated with our estimate, in addition to be able to convey information about our level of estimate accuracy. So that is the presentation for today. I'm sorry we had problems early on and lost minutes for questions, but I'm happy to stick around as long as anybody has some questions here.
There was the contingency part and how you explained it thoroughly. We have a few questions in here, if everyone wants to stick in. I would start with, so the first question we have is from Jasleen. So he's asking, AACE provides guidance on purpose of every estimate class. How could you improve accuracy at high-level estimates, 5 or 4, for fast-track projects and requires full project funding at early stage rather than after following a phased approval process?
Yep, so that's a very good question, and it implies that we're going to have that there's going to be much more uncertainty conveyed with our funding decision estimate because we're at such an early stage of project development. We at ACE, there's many risk analysis associated recommended practices. And there's an online document called the Professional Guidance Document number 02, Professional Guidance Document number 2, that talks about the various risk analysis methods. One of those being a parametric method. And that would be a preferred approach for many projects. Now with a parametric methodology, the methodology itself is fairly easy. It's very quick to do, typically. All the work, though, has to be done ahead of time. We need to be able to create a parametric model. We need to collect data around cost growth in comparison to project characteristics. And using that data, we can generate algorithms that try to correlate characteristics to cost growth or characteristics to contingency values. I'm writing a paper with Shoshana Freisinger for presentation at this year's annual conference, ACE conference. And one of them will be talking about some of these various methods and where they can be applied in early stages. because it may be time to market. Pharmaceutical companies, for example, typically time to market is everything, and they sometimes need to fund in early stages. Pipeline companies are the types of companies that sometimes will fund back at a class 4 stage. But what you're going to do is you're going to see that you're going to have a very flat curve. This curve is going to be much wider, and you're going to have to accept a greater absolute value of risk funds, contingency and/or management reserves to reach an appropriate level of confidence of underrun versus overrun. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you.
If I can just add to
Yes.
that a little bit, Larry.
Yes.
Yeah, it's Don Dark here from AAC Australia. Yeah, look, I think one of the other things to consider there, and you mentioned it earlier, if you want to improve your upfront accuracy, you've got to look at front end loading of your project, which means that you need to identify the areas that are going to give you the most risk within your scope or your delivery, and do extra work on those early in the stages. So you might have a specific environmental issue or something like that provides risk. To address that, you might want to do some extra work on that early on to give yourself a better understanding of what your numbers might look like. And
That's
again, that affects
Don.
your estimate class, and it affects your bottom line.
Yeah, again, the only way we change the blue curve is by doing better project definition. And if we need to reduce the level of contingency or risk funds in early phases, then we need, again, use some kind of Pareto analysis so you understand, is it site conditions, or is it the cost? Can I try to get a budget cost or even a fixed quote for significant equipment early on? We're going to have to change our project development process to try to address some of those key levels of uncertainty, as you mentioned, and drive those into earlier phase work. Another question, Kareem?
Yep. There's a few questions, and Amin has raised his hand. We will address your question, Amin, after we address the questions in this chat. So we have another question from Jaslene. So do we use triangular distribution most of the time, or other distributions are suggested for Monte Carlo?
Triangular distributions are probably one of the most common, but there are definitely some significant problems with triangular as they're typically used. Triangular distributions, when we're the risk facilitator, we're trying to understand what the low and the high value is for a triangular distribution. Often we get caught up in optimism bias. We simply don't use a low enough figure for a low enough value for the low range and a high enough value for the high range. In the example with the 3 elements, and one went from 15 to 20 to 30, I think it was, or something like that. Is 15 really the lowest conceivable? Because that 15 at the tails of the distribution, that value of 15 was probably associated with a probability of occurrence of 0.000000001%. We have to be able to think, is that really conceivable? So some of our risk tools, such as at-risk or crystal ball, have what's called a triangular. It's a bounded triangular, but basically it takes your low value and the high value, and then you can associate, and you say, well, that low value really represents the P5 value or the P10 value. And my high value actually represents the P90 or the P95 value. So doing that helps because, again, otherwise we're just not going to capture adequate tail risk with a normal triangular distribution. But there are other distributions, and there is a recommended practice, and I forget the number of it. I apologize for that. Just about selecting probability distributions. But beta distributions, and there's other log normal distributions. There's other distributions that can help define and probably better emulate the skewness to our distributions than a triangular distribution. It works especially for a very small project or a less significant project. I might be fine just using triangulars or a bounded triangular. But most of the time in more significant projects, I'm selecting other distributions besides triangular.
Okay. Yep. So we do have a few more questions, but we ran out of time. So who wants to stick to listen to the rest of the questions, please feel free. Otherwise, otherwise you can leave if all is good. So
yeah, and I apologize again for our audio problems at the start.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. So another question from Fanny. Where can I find more practical examples about building the blue estimate curve from scratch?
So the estimate curve is typically generated through quantitative risk analysis, and ACE has several recommended practices. I would start by reading professional guidance document number 2, and that is an online document. So that's not a recommended practice. It's a guidance document. It's in the technical section of the ACE website. It's an online document that you don't even need to be a member to be able to get that document. That'll describe many of the various methodologies that can be used. And then there are recommended practices behind these several individual quantitative risk analysis methodologies. Some use Monte Carlo simulations, some do not. Some use a CPM scheduling, cost-loaded CPM scheduling to be able to generate. But that's where you would start, is read PGD02, and then the selected risk analysis recommended practices.
The next question comes from Sadat. How do you differentiate scope change, which is excluded from project risk, and low-level scope definition?
Yeah, and that's always the tough thing, because when our management, if we're an oil company and our management's thinking, well, we specified we wanted an 80,000 barrel per day facility that creates this spec of various products. Well, that's what management thinks is the scope of the project. And that's the beginning scope. Back at class 5, that's how we created our class 5 estimate. It was probably just plugging into a quick capacity factored estimating tool and plugged in 80,000 barrels per day, and it generated out, a cost, per barrel that then totaled up to the overall cost. But as we go through our stages of project development, as we move from class 5 to class 4, by class 4, we typically have a near final complete equipment list. And we've done heat and material balances, and we have process flow diagrams. So from a project team perspective, now we're looking at anything that significantly changes that any of those key defining engineering and our key defining planning deliverables is a change that may require not to be funded out of contingency. And certainly by class 3, when we have final approved equipment lists, final approved plot plans and general arrangement drawings, final approved P&IDs, those define the scope of the project. It's much more detailed and granular than an 80,000 barrel per day facility. And we need to be able to convey that information to management, who says, well, we didn't change the scope over the last estimate. How come it's grown? Well, it's because when we went through our P&IDs and went through our project definition, we had to relay out some of the equipment. We added additional redundant equipment to meet, certain requirements that our project team wanted to have as far as redundancy or other issues. When we're adding those things that change defining engineering technical deliverables, we have to regard that as a change in scope, and we simply have to be able to communicate that to management and come back to management and ask for more money. Because if we don't ask for more money and we fund that out of contingency, then we're going to run out of contingency in most cases.
Yep, makes perfect sense. I don't think we can address all of the questions, but we'll take one more now and see how about the time going. So another question from Sadat. Most of the time we develop a point estimate and then determine the contingency based on QRA from the risk register. How is the best way to apply the contingency in that situation, rather than using range estimate for each of the item in our estimate, as we can have thousands of items in our estimate?
Yes, so as you go through if you mentioned that you're using a QRA process, so that QRA process, that effective QRA process is always going to end up generating either a cumulative, or in this case, more of a histogram type of cost distribution. Mm-hmm. So once we have that cost distribution, then we can intelligently understand how much contingency we need to add to our point estimate to reach a given level of underrun versus overrun. There are potentially thousands of elements. Now, we need to be careful when we run, especially when we use QRA methods that use Monte Carlo simulation. We should be inputting only the most critical risk drivers or drivers of risk into our model. The more elements you enter into a Monte Carlo simulation, it naturally wants to, that central limit theorem kicks in. And if we have 1,000 elements, it's going to tighten around the mean of the distribution, much more so than if we only had identified the 15 or 20 most critical drivers of risk. So it's partly a case of understanding how to use the tools, how to use quantitative risk analysis tools effectively. And that typically means out of the thousands of things that may appear on a risk register, or the thousands of elements individually within our estimate, we're only looking at the key defining ones. The other thing that's really important and is stressed in our ACE risk analysis recommended practices is we shouldn't be estimate ranging at line item levels of the estimate. In other words, we don't throw a 3-point range around every element of our estimate. We define what are the risk drivers, and the risk drivers are not at that element level. The risk drivers are things that, such as, quantity growth at either the overall estimate level or at the discipline level. Well, what about piping quantity growth? But we don't do it at the individual line items of the estimate. If we do, then we're going to have too many things included in our QRA analysis, especially if running through Monte Carlo simulation, and we're going to underestimate the potential uncertainties and the contingency values that we end up assigning.
So thank you, Larry. I think we will just direct all of the other questions, direct them to the community page. I will add the link into the chat now. Feel free, we didn't answer a few of the questions. Feel free to add the discussion there, and invite you as well, Larry, if you could answer these questions there, just for the public to see how it works. So we'll keep the discussion going, and we may end the event and say, to have a good night for everyone in Australia, and good morning for you, Larry. Yeah, it's not morning yet, but yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Yep, I'll try to address any other questions that come up. And also feel free to give my, I was going to add it on the slide and I apparently forgot to do that, Kareem. But you could send my email address, and if they have specific questions, address them there. I can't answer thousands of questions, but so just be kind. It may take me a few days, but I'll certainly try to address questions that are sent to me via email as well.
Yeah. How about that, to keep it open and public for everyone? How about I'll add you in the Australian section, so anyone would post a question there, so there will be a discussion thread for everyone to read. Happy with that?
That'll be great, Kareem. Yep.
Okay, so all good there. And thank you all for attending, and thank you, Larry, and have a good night.
You're very
have
welcome.
A good morning. Cheers, man. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this AACE Australian section webinar. If you would like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and feel free to leave any comments and suggestions for future topics in the comments. We hope you enjoyed this presentation and look forward to seeing you next time.